Sound matters. Be heard. Welcome to the podcast where you get exclusive behind-the-scenes tips to make your own show sound truly spectacular. This is Podtastic Audio.
Hey, what's happening? How are you doing? How is your podcast coming along? I am Chris, and I am from the original Chris and Christine Show podcast. You can find out every single thing about that show on a website which I built all by myself. Yeah, check that out at chrisandchristineshow.com. But here is Podtastic Audio, the show that you asked for because you asked me, how do you make all the magic happen? I think it's some kind of magic sauce that I got figured out how to do this podcasting stuff. It's not that hard. All you really have to do is listen to what you're doing and listen to your own show and listen to what works best for you. But before I go any further, let me tell you that your podcast is your podcast. Listen, you can do your show however you want to do it. If you have a way to do your own show and a method to your own madness, you just keep on doing it, because however you decide to edit your show, or if you decide that you maybe do not edit your show, listen, everybody should at least edit their show a little bit. I know I'm guilty of the same thing. When I say editing, it doesn't just mean chopping out all the ums and stupid words we say and different things like that, and the coughs and the ums and don't you knows. It's more than just that. It's physically making sure your audio is up to par. Like, it sounds decent enough to where when you push play on it, people aren't like, ugh, what is this garbage? Or they crank it up full blast because you set it out at a very low volume level. Here's a little tip on that, is that it's like getting a haircut, right? You always can chop off more, but you can never grow more back after they cut it off. In other words, if you record your volume too low and they crank it full blast, there's a max on your volume knob in whatever device you're playing with. Your car stereo, regular stereo, you only can go so high. And if your volume is so low that the person's at full blast, you shouldn't be at full blast. So you always can boost your volume higher when you do your post-production, because if it's too loud on someone's device, they always can bring it down. It's hard to go back up if it goes to a ceiling. That's all I'm saying with that. So I like to have my shows a little bit louder than some of the other shows out there, just because I want to make sure that no matter what vehicle you're in, no matter where you're listening to the show, you always, no matter what, can always hear the show loud and clear. So today on this episode of Podtastic Audio, I was thinking that recently I was doing a lot of editing for these interviews that Christine and I did. We did a bunch, and we've been kind of so busy, we've kind of had to back down on taking as many guest requests as we have in the past. It just happens to be the limited availability to physically sit down and record an interview. Like, we pigeonhole these interview requests into the small little window of opportunity of time that we do not have a lot of extra time for guest interviews. So we've had to cancel on a lot of them. And if you are listening right now and we've had to cancel on you, I'm extremely sorry. It's just that we do, with Christine going back to doing the wedding business on the weekends and me working during the day and her working during the day, it literally limits our opportunity to like 1 hour a weekend to do a guest interview. And then now we just found out we have Little League for our youngest son. He's in Little League during the time we normally would record guest interviews. So we're working out all the kinks right now, and it's been very, very busy. But I had some interviews that I had to get to. And after I do a recording of a guest interview, I like to, go to work on it and not let it sit in a folder somewhere. I try to, depending on time, of course, I like to actually get the podcast interview edited and put away, stashed away as a finished episode interview, ready to go, so that when Christine and I are physically ready to actually do the regular part of the episode, because we do a front end and a back end, like a donut, is basically we wrap around the interview itself. So when we do create that little section there, that is done on the spot, but the interview part is inserted in the middle. So all we have to do is show up for like 30 minutes or so, do our front end and back end, and then I do my fancy editing and make sure it all mixes together very smoothly. So before we have a chance to do that part, I like to have the interviews physically done and put away. Maybe it's a little OCD that I have that I can't start a project until one thing is physically finished and completed. I know it's hard. I know some people, when they do a lot of podcast interviews, they'll save them on their Zoom account or whatever account they use, and they will just stockpile them all. And the day or week of the particular interview is going to be released, they'll go back in and actually edit the interview and get it all ready to go. That takes more time. Yes, I get it. So time is a currency that we do not have a limited supply of. So I value my time quite a bit. So today we're going to go over how I particularly edit interviews for the Chris and Christine show and for this show. And also as a bonus, I will show you how I edit my client's show, which is basically the same thing. It's also an interview style of a show. It's a group of my clients on the call together, and we talk and they do their thing, and I record it and edit it the same exact way. Now, for the record here, you can record your podcast however you want. So you can record your interviews however you want. You can use whichever tool you want, whether it's Zoom, StreamYard, CleanFeed, Joe Blow's House of Recording Podcasts. I don't know, whichever one you use. It's really up to you. These principles and these techniques will work for whoever and whatever. It doesn't matter, because at the core of it all, you're creating an audio podcast. Are you not? Great. So this is how I make audio podcast interviews sound amazing. So here we go. First things first, I'm assuming you've already booked your guest, and I'm assuming you've already done some research on your guest, but it's not always necessary. You can get the basics on your guest and ask a lot of good follow-up questions. Get them to tell amazing stories, which is also key with an audio podcast. So let's just say you got your podcast up and recording, you're recording your guest, and everything sounds amazing. That's first things first. Make sure that your guest has amazing or decent audio, I should say, because I know not every guest comes in with, an amazing podcast setup. I know that, especially if you're interviewing people that aren't usually podcasters or broadcasters. They usually do not have the best gear and equipment, and you have to deal with what you got to deal with. I understand that. But the first things first is try to get your recording on separate audio tracks. That is key number one. Now, however you got to do that, whether it's recording it with the Rodecaster like I have here, I can record myself, I can record Christine, and I can record up to 4 people in this room with separate microphones. I can do that and have a guest on a 5th track. So that's 5 tracks. I can do it that way. So it doesn't matter to me which device we use, whether it's a phone call, a Zoom call, CleanFeed, Squadcast, it doesn't matter, because I can take in all of those audio feeds directly into the Rodecaster, save them on the memory card as separate audio tracks. Now, that is one way to do it. Another way to do it is no matter which platform you do use to record your interviews with, some actually will deliver you separate audio files for each participant in the conversation. It could be whether it's using, I think Zoom does something like that, but they might be maxed out on I haven't used Zoom to record in a long time, but there may be a max on how many separate audio tracks they give you. Maybe they don't give you. I don't know. I think StreamYard does too, but I think you got to pay for that feature. I think Squadcast does, and a lot of them do. Riverside, I think they say they do. I've heard horror stories about Riverside, but I'm not here to bash anybody. I'm just saying that's what I've heard so far. I have not used it, so I can't verify. But a lot of them do. What you got to do is get separate audio tracks for every person in the conversation. Now, once you have that, we can move on to step number 2. Now, depending on how bad the audio quality is from the participants in the call, say your guest or whatever, hopefully your audio sounds great, but sometimes your guest, they don't always sound that great. So what you got to do is use a little finesse on their audio and your audio. Try to do some EQ and make it sound phenomenal, level everything out. But where do you start when you have the audio tracks? What I've done is a few different things. one thing I like to use, I've mentioned this before, is I like to use the Levelator app I have on the Mac. And for some reason, I can't seem to find the Levelator app in the App Store anymore. I don't know if I can't find it, what I'm doing wrong, but I know it's out there somewhere. It may be a file, like a program that's going into your computer versus an app. I thought it was on the App Store. Anyways, I like to use the Levelator app because it is totally free. You can use it as much as you want, unlimited, have at it, go right ahead. It's a pretty simple app. You take your WAV file and you drop it in there, and it makes a super awesome sounding, leveled version of that audio track. So I do that first off with the audio tracks to get everybody a good baseline before we enter them into the audio workstation, which I like to use Audacity. By the way, Levelator is free. Audacity is free. So far, we're spending nothing on this little project here. So I drop into Audacity. Audacity does let you do multi-track editing, so you can have multiple tracks in the DAW at the same time, and you can actually edit them individually from each other. So what I do is when I got all the tracks in there, I will work on one at a time. So I will highlight solo on the track that I'm working on. So let's just say, for example, I've got 3 participants on this interview, and I've got 3 different tracks. So the first track I will work on will be the top one. I'll hit select that one, hit solo on that one. So I'll be working on that one only. And when I go through that audio track, one of the first things I like to do is the noise reduction feature. It's built into Audacity. It's one of the free tools in there for the effects section. You go in there and figure out how to do a noise reduction. If you're not familiar how to do that, the way it works basically is this, is that during the audio track, all that noise or hum or anything in the background of that person's audio file, especially if they have bad audio, sometimes they do, your guest, who knows, right? You go through there and you highlight a blank section of audio space. It's like maybe 3 seconds or so of blank space, highlighting that kind of hissing noise that you hear on the audio track. Highlight that in the noise reduction. You have to hit select. Basically, you're telling the computer hey, this audio here, this little hiss here, you find this, and this is what we're going to look for. So you're telling the computer, hey, this is what the problem is. You go back into noise reduction, and you set the noise reduction for that entire audio track. Now, you can adjust the level on how much you want to use for noise reduction. I would not tweak with it too much. Little things go a long way when it comes to editing your podcast. Little increment, little movements, and little adjustments here and there do wonders. You go too much, it's like doing a bad haircut. You go too deep, and next thing you know, you get to shave your head because you screwed up too much. And speaking of screwing up too much, before we go on, I want to let you know that when I do edit interviews or edit client shows, I basically do this in 2 major sections spread out over possibly 2 days or 3 days. I've tried to do it all in one session, and I have done that, but it does kind of burn me out when I do it like that. So when I break it into 2 chunks, it seems like I can get it done easier. So the first chunk is basically getting the audio to sound great. The levels are great. The audio file is great. It's not quite finished yet, but it sounds great, basically. And then the second part of that is I will go through and cut out all the stupid stuff, the gaps, the ums, whatever. I mean, not everything, but basically make it sound great by how it flows and getting rid of stuff that's not really that important. Okay, so moving back to sound editing. So you got the separate audio tracks. You got them into your Audacity like I have here, and you got one track at a time. So once you got the noise reduction done, the next thing I really need to do is go through there and look for audio sounds that should not be there. And this is where you have to really go through and scroll through. And if you find something it shouldn't be there, like a bump or a cough or a scratch or anything that's not like a vocal where they actually said something, or even a laugh is fine. You can leave laughs in or chuckles, leave those in. It adds a little dimension to the conversation when you do that. But anything that's not like supposed to be there, I highlight and I silence, highlight and silence, highlight and silence. So once you go through each track and basically do these things for each audio track, then you're almost there. So with the new update to Audacity, it does let you do real-time effects. Now, if you're not familiar with what a real-time effect really does to the audio, is that you can tweak the sounds of the audio track in real time, not while you record it, but after it's been recorded. You can play the audio file and you can play around with these real-time effects live as the audio track is being played. So you press play on the audio track, and you have to get these effects through a plug-in feature in Audacity. Now, there are paid versions of real-time effects, and there are free ones. The free one that I have discovered, well, I think because I have a Mac computer, Apple computer, Apple does have one that is in there, and I like to use that. It's basically like the one that I like to use. It gives you this kind of like this noise gate level of either a light noise gate, a medium noise gate, or a harsh noise gate. I like to keep it on a light noise gate for each person's track, meaning that if anything else is happening while they're not talking, you shouldn't hear anything in that person's track. It does help. It's another level of security to make sure that while there is a space in between when they're talking and somebody else should be talking, it does a light noise gate to kind of filter some of that stuff. Now, with the program that I like to use is by MUSE. It's MUSE. I discovered it because I went to the plugin manager on Audacity and I just looked up free plugins for Audacity. And it had this like full-on package that I had to download to my computer. If I can find it here. Okay, I got it. It is a plugin suite by MUSE FX. Now, I got this directly from Audacity plugins. Now, according to what I have in front of me here, the MUSE FX is a collection of essential effects containing a chorus, compressor, de-esser, delay, master, noise gate, pitch effects, reverb, rotary, and 2 other EQ effects. Now, I downloaded all of these because I want to make sure I have all of them at my disposal so I can use them to fix whatever I possibly can use. But there's really only 3 or so I use in the entire group. Now, it says MUSE FX is a free and expanding collection of high-quality plugins for Audacity. MUSE Score 4 and any VST3 compatible host. MUSE FX brings these tools to you. You need them to elevate your mix to a higher level, which is basically what I use it for in the first place. So each track, I will go through there and pick there's probably 4 that I like to really mess with. Now you're probably thinking, hey, Chris, if I go in there and start tinkering with all these different effects, I might screw up my audio and I can't figure out how to get it back to where it sounds like it's supposed to sound in the first place because I've added like 100 different effects on it. What do I do? Well, don't you worry, because they are real-time effects. You can click the X box and you can undo each one, tweak each one individually, and it does not affect the finished product. It basically is running in real time. Now, the only downside, I have to say, if you add a ton of different effects to each track, which I usually do about 4 or so to each track, and say there's 3, that's 16 or so different effects you got running, plus all of the other effects that I've already do, it does take a little longer, I noticed, to finish the finished wave file audio track as a whole, like the mix down as you were. It does take, I've had it take up to like 8 minutes. And I'm running a M1 MacBook Pro, which is supposed to be fairly fast, but maybe it's just not fast enough. I only can imagine if I had like 100 tracks on here and I was doing like lots and lots of different effects on each track, it would take an hour, maybe even more, to process an audio file that big. But be aware when you do run a lot of real-time effects, it does gobble up a lot of juice on your computer. So you kind of have to have either a powerful computer or have a little patience to get the job done. I was just thinking that my old dinosaur, PC computer, it would never, ever, ever be able to do that. It couldn't do the real-time. It had a hard time as it was saving an MP3 file. I mean, literally, it would take like 5 minutes to finish a regular MP3. I mean, this thing takes a few seconds, but I'm saying you add a lot of real-time effects, and not all computers can do it. Maybe it's just a Mac thing. I don't know. I don't have a PC running Audacity to really test this on, but that's where I found it. And the ones that I use are basically, there is a de-esser, but don't go too harsh because it'll cut off some of the S's and things. You kind of play with these things kind of lightly and see how they sound, because you play them, you physically can listen back as it's being played live and adjust things in real time, almost like bass and treble. In fact, bass and treble, is one of the effects that Audacity gives you for free right in their plugin there. So if somebody's coming in on a phone, for example, I will try to take down some of the treble and add a little bass. And then I'll really go in there with all the different effects and try to tweak it the best I possibly can. After you make an adjustment with these real-time effects, you play with them. You can get an idea what it sounds like. And if you do like it, well, then you can continue. If you don't like it, you always can adjust things and change things later. So that's what I do for each available track before I put it all into one final mix down, which is at a WAV file. By the way, I keep everything as a WAV file. All this stuff is WAV files. Everything's a WAV file until the finished final episode has been up and sent to the audio media host. That I use an MP3. But for everything else, I use WAV files, which do take up a lot of space. You don't think about it because it's just audio, right? But WAV files are massive if you have hour-long conversations and if you have multiple tracks of them, you're saving with all these special effects and all that stuff. So it does take a long time. So after I have the finished mix down, I will definitely take that and run it back through Levelator to level everybody again, once again. Now, previously, when I'm doing the tweaking on each individual audio track in Audacity, I will adjust levels to make them sound fairly level as they are. Although each track was also ran through Levelator to begin with. The reason why I do it at the very beginning is in case somebody is kind of quiet and kind of loud and pitching, their volumes are kind of all over the place, especially with a guest, because a guest will kind of like move around and they'll kind of go, sometimes they'll get excited, they'll get spiky, and sometimes they'll get kind of quiet and kind of relax and things like that. So to kind of tame some of that, I will definitely run that through Levelator, which is a compressor, a normalizer, and it kind of helps level all that stuff out to keep it the same. So when everything is mushed together, all three of these audio files are now put into one finished WAV file. I will run that back through Levelator. Now, if they have a lot of room of reverb, or they have some echo, or they've got bad equipment, which usually it seems like my client shows, I mean, they don't have the best gear. They're using headsets and laptop microphones and, just conferencing tools, things like that, not real microphones. So what I have to do is run it through the Adobe Podcast Enhance, which for the record now, they are charging for. They do have a free version, but it only allows you to do up to 30 minutes of audio. So most interviews usually go longer than 30 minutes, but if you have a 30-minute interview, you can make this work, I guess. But you drop it in there, and then what it's supposed to do is take away some of the, more like the echo sound. Like if they have somebody on a walkie-talkie cell phone or something, it kind of makes it sound, well, it's supposed to make it sound like as if it was coming in on a studio microphone. It does a fairly good job. It's not as professional as being on a microphone, but it's the closest thing we got. It's done through AI. It does a fairly decent job. So I will run it all through there. And now that I'm paying for the service, I can adjust it, how I want, to 1% to 100% and anywhere in between. So what I'll try to do is try to keep it around 90% if it's really bad, maybe 80% if it's kind of so-so, if it's okay. Save that file, and then we are ready to rock and roll and move on to the second section, which is basically chopping out all the boring crap we don't need. So I will take that audio file and drop it into Audacity here, and I will begin working on taking out every single thing that I do not think is necessary. I do a very quick job on this, by the way. Well, quick meaning it might take me maybe an hour to do this. Both sections take about an hour or so. So the first section to actually get the audio sounding great and all the plugins sounding great, that can take about an hour to do all that. And then the second section of actually removing all of the gaps or the and and ums and a lot of that stuff. And maybe there was a long pause at the beginning of the recording because you hit record first, like you probably should. And then you waited for everything to make sure everything was recording, as you can see. Then you began talking. So you can cut out that part too, which I usually do also. And at the tail end, the same thing goes there too, because you'll say, okay, it's the wrap. See you later. And then you wait a second or so, and then you stop the recording. There's probably about a good section of blank audio on the back end. Cut that out too. So I'll go through it I usually like to work from the back to the front when I'm working in Audacity. The reason why is because when you press play on a section of audio, the audio kind of moves from left to right. So if I work from right to left, I can kind of go back and then press play, and it kind of goes back over what I edited. So it's kind of the way I do it now. A lot of people do it however you want to do it. It's up to you. But that's the way I work when I work on trimming the actual podcast, or editing, if you want to call it the editing section. But to me, it's all editing, really. Anything that you take from the very beginning and you have a finished product at the end, anything in the middle that you did to the audio, anything at all, that's all editing. It all falls under the umbrella of editing as far as I'm concerned. So once I'm finished with that, I have a finished file, single file that is a WAV file. I save it also as a WAV. Remember, I keep everything a WAV until I need to send it to the media host. So that's also a WAV. So, and with all these different files and interviews and folders and different things, how do I keep everything organized? Well, I am working really hard on being more organized with my computer. My little MacBook Pro, the little pro that could, I guess, as you call it, I am overwhelming the computer with so much stuff. I realized that when I was trying to do a YouTube video and I moved my files into my iMovie folder, is that it wasn't taking the files because my hard drive, I guess, was near capacity. I was like, what? How is that possible? So I only have like the 512 gig hard drive on this MacBook. That's why I have external hard drives. Now, with the external hard drives, what I like to do is, because I like to keep every project in its own folder file. And I should have mentioned this earlier, is that when I am working on doing all those live plugins for the audio files, when I'm working on that part, in addition to actually saving it at its own single audio track, I also save that entire project. If you go in Audacity, hit Save Project, it'll save the entire project as an Audacity file. So that way, if you want to go back to that section of stuff, like all the plugins and all your stuff you had laid out, if you want to go back there and tweak something, you still physically can do that. So I will save that file, and then I will put everything in its own little folder on my computer. It'll be whatever the name of the guest is, or in my case for the client show, it'll be the name of that episode, and it'll be all in that little folder file. So it's all there ready to go, so that when and if I ever go back to it, I have it still. Now, it still sits on my computer until the episode has been released to the world and everything sounds good, no complaints or anything like that. Then I will delete it from the computer. But I always, no matter what, back up everything to my external hard drive. So on my external hard drive, I have the same folder with the same stuff in it. It's just sitting on my hard drive off of the computer. Like I said, I'm running low on space here, so I can't keep everything on the computer like I used to back in the olden days. And these files, especially WAV files, they do take up a lot of space. So once they are done and the episode has been released, I get rid of it, good riddance. But I still have it as a backup on the actual computer, because you just never know. You may have to go back and fix something or something. And I'm probably the worst at getting rid of stuff. I think I'm more like an audio or file hoarder. Like I keep files and folders and stuff and pictures and stuff that I probably should delete, but I just like to have it because you just never know. I always feel like you just never know if you're going to need this stuff again in the future. So that's why I probably keep everything. And that's probably why I have a 12 gigabyte hard drive or a 12 terabyte hard drive, which I probably should get another one now I think about it. Gosh, not that I'm filling this one up, but in the future, if I decide to go more video style stuff and become more YouTuber style of stuff, then I'm going to need a bigger place to put stuff, maybe a bigger computer to work on stuff. So I'm thinking about upgrading to another computer to work on either audio and maybe do some video stuff too. So I know my computer can probably handle some video stuff. Yes, I make YouTube videos, but that is for another podcast on another day. Here, we're talking about editing a great podcast interview. Now, once you've done all that wonderful stuff and it's all saved on your computer and it's all saved up, ready to go. So depending on what show I'm using, so if it's a Chris and Christine show, obviously I will find that audio file and I will do our best to We'll talk about the interview. We'll talk about the guest. We'll do our best in the front and the back end. And I will insert that audio file in the mix down when I mix everything together for a finished show. Now, when you do that, I try to make sure the levels sound somewhat similar. You can tweak around with the volume levels, or you can tweak around with making sure that everything is on the same LUF level, which is 16 LUFs is what I keep everything at. Audio files for interviews, spoken audio. I like to keep it all at 16 LUFs. It's in the Audacity. You go down to loudness, normalization. In there, it's usually set for whatever you want to set it to. I click it to minus 16 LUFs. I keep it there, and it sounds fairly great. That's what I keep it at when it's all said and done. And then you send it out to the old podcast host in the sky, and everybody can enjoy it. Then I get rid of it off the computer, like I said before, and I move on. Now, that is how I edit podcast interviews or group interview sessions. But the key is to all of this is make sure that every single participant in the conversation is on their own individual audio track. If you can make that happen, you are golden. You are in the easy street after that. If everything is in one mono mush track together, there's not a lot you really can do. You can use Auphonic to fix some of that stuff. You can use some noise reduction, things like that. There are some things you can do, but it's not going to be as good as if you have individual audio tracks. You see, when I first started doing the podcasting back in 2019, I knew none of this stuff. I didn't know anything about separate audio tracks or even how to get separate audio tracks. I didn't know any of this stuff. I just knew it was all in one mono track, and I heard her, she heard me. It was all together, mishmash, and I didn't know about any of this stuff. Of course, our earlier episodes, the audio did suffer. It sounds way better today, like light years better today than it did even 2 years ago. So keep that in mind, that you always can be evolving your show and always be learning of new ways and easy ways to make sure your show sounds phenomenal. Hey, thank you once again for listening to this episode. And if you know anybody, or perhaps maybe you're on the fence of maybe creating a podcast, and you're like, I don't even know how or where, don't you worry, I will hook you up. You gotta head on over to podtasticaudio.com/easy, and I will personally help you design and create and even record your podcast for you. And I will catch you on the next episode.